They say no one survives long in a storm like that, not without a reason, and yet something out there was trying, clawing through wind and snow for one last chance. The blizzard didn't just roll in, it attacked. Walls of white slammed against the mountain like waves crashing on cliffs. Pine trees bent beneath the weight of the storm, groaning as branches cracked and ice sealed everything in silence. The kind of silence that smothers. At the peak, hidden by trees and distance, sat an old ranger cabin, its roof hunched under snow, its chimney barely breathing smoke. Inside, Thomas Raines sat alone at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't noticed. He rarely noticed anymore. Retired, forgotten by the world and mostly fine with it, he lived tucked away from it all, in the far reaches of the mountain, where memories couldn't follow, at least not easily. The wind screamed through the shutters. Scout, his old German shepherd, lifted his head but didn't move from the rug near the fire. This was normal by now. Storms came and went. Life in the cabin had its rhythms: coffee, wood chopping, feeding Scout, eating in silence. Thomas had once stitched up men under mortar fire with his bare hands. Now his days were filled with watching snowflakes melt on the windowsill. Until the sound came. It was small at first, a dull thud, almost swallowed by the wind. Probably just a branch, he told himself. The pines snap like bones when the ice gets thick, but then it came again, louder, closer. He stood slowly, not rushing. His body no longer moved that way. Scout growled softly. That wasn't a branch. He opened the cabin door, instantly hit with a wall of freezing air so sharp it made his eyes water. Visibility was near zero. Snow blew sideways like shards of glass. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and stepped onto the porch. That's when he saw the figures, or thought he did. Two dark shapes barely visible through the blur of white. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks, but they moved, slowly, unsteadily, and then one collapsed. He stepped down into the snow, boots crunching, breath steaming in front of him. As he got closer, the shapes took form, two horses, wild Mustangs. One stood protectively over the other, whose legs were folded beneath its trembling body. Their coats were caked with frost, sides heaving, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something else, pleading. The standing one had a gash across its shoulder, raw and frozen over. The collapsed one tried to rise, legs slipping. Thomas froze. Mustangs don't come near people unless something is wrong, very wrong. The wind howled around them, and for a second he felt like he was back in Afghanistan, crouched in the dirt as a helicopter screamed overhead. That same adrenaline, that same quiet voice in his gut saying, "You can't walk away from this." He looked at the horses and they looked right back. That's when it hit him. They weren't running from something, they were coming to him. By the time he opened the barn doors, his hands were stiff with cold and his heart was pounding harder than it had in years. He wasn't sure what he was doing, hadn't worked with horses since he was a kid on his uncle's farm. But this wasn't about experience, it was about instinct. The mare nudged the younger one forward, carefully guiding him into the dim shelter of the barn. He stumbled in, collapsing on the straw-covered floor as soon as he crossed the threshold. The mare followed, standing guard like a sentinel. Thomas backed away, still stunned by what had just happened. He closed the barn door against the storm, and the sudden silence inside felt sacred. Two wild Mustangs had come to his door, not as intruders, but as survivors searching for sanctuary, and somehow he realized they had chosen him. The barn was old, half-rotted in places, with gaps in the walls that let cold air snake through like fingers. But it was dry, and it was shelter. The horses didn't seem to care about the floors. They stood there, breathing heavily, steam rising off their bodies. Thomas moved slowly around them, careful not to make sudden movements. The older one, definitely the mare, watched him closely, muscles tight with tension. She was still protecting the younger one, who lay curled on the straw, legs folded awkwardly beneath him, sides quivering with exhaustion. Thomas fetched the emergency supplies he kept stashed in a wooden crate at the back of the barn, mostly left over from his army days. A few rolls of gauze, some iodine, a weathered stethoscope, and an old thermal blanket. He grabbed 2 bales of hay and unrolled a few burlap sacks to make a sort of padding on the floor. Scout waited at the door, tail low, ears pricked, knowing better than to interfere. Thomas glanced back at him and gave a small nod. Stay. The mare allowed him to step closer. She didn't back away, but her nostrils flared as he approached the colt. He could tell the younger horse was in pain. His leg was twisted at an angle that wasn't quite right. It wasn't broken, at least not obviously, but swollen, stiff, maybe sprained badly. The colt flinched when Thomas knelt beside him. That old instinct kicked in again, the medic in him, hands steady, mind quiet, focused. He spoke in a low voice, not even knowing why. Habit, maybe. A memory from years of triage under fire where words kept people anchored to life. "You're all right, I've got you." The blanket he wrapped around the colt was scratchy and patched in places, but it was warm. He checked for bleeding, felt the pulse at the fetlock. Weak but steady. The swelling was bad. He took a strip of fabric, dipped it in iodine, and gently began cleaning around the leg. The colt whimpered, a soft, broken sound that made Thomas pause for a moment. He hadn't heard an animal cry like that since the war. He exhaled slowly, pressing the cloth against the wound again, careful not to let his hands shake. The mare stood over them both now, breathing hard, nostrils flaring. She didn't trust him, not fully, but something in her eyes had changed. There was no panic, no wild fear, just guarded hope. Hours passed without him noticing. The storm outside beat against the roof, relentless. But inside that barn, a fragile calm had settled. Thomas rigged a rough pen from some old fencing panels, laid more straw, and checked the mare's gash. Superficial. She'd make it. Her coat was thick, the kind that had seen many winters. She'd kept the colt alive through whatever had happened out there. Now she was letting him help. By the time Thomas sat down against the wall, the adrenaline had faded, and the ache in his knees reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. Scout padded in, finally allowed to join, and lay beside him with a soft sigh. The fire in the cabin had probably gone out by now. The coffee left on the stove would be ice, but he didn't care. The barn was quiet except for the soft breathing of the horses and the wind whispering through the beams. For the first time in a long time, Thomas wasn't just alive. He felt useful. That feeling had been missing for years. After the war, he'd tried normal life, town jobs, social events, therapy sessions that never quite stuck. Eventually, he'd left it all behind, chasing solitude in the mountains like a man chasing a ghost. He thought he'd buried his purpose out here, but tonight, wrapped in the stillness of the barn, kneeling beside a wounded animal who had come to him for help, it felt like something had cracked open inside, something long frozen. He leaned his head back against the wooden beam behind him and closed his eyes for just a moment. Not to sleep, he wouldn't dare sleep, but to breathe, to listen. The colt shifted slightly under the blanket. The mare lowered her head and gently nuzzled his side, a gesture of reassurance. Of love, maybe. Thomas watched them, a lump growing in his throat that he didn't quite understand. He had seen people die in his arms. He had carried the weight of men who never made it home, and somehow 2 half-frozen horses had managed to stir a part of him no one else could reach. He reached out and gently stroked the mare's neck. Her muscles tightened at first, but then relaxed. Her coat was thick with frost, but beneath it he felt warmth, life, trust, beginning to take root. He whispered, not knowing if she understood, "You're safe here, both of you." He meant it. And for the first time in years he realized maybe he wasn't meant to be alone after all. The storm had passed, but its silence lingered like an echo, the kind of hush that doesn't bring peace, but a strange kind of awareness, as if the world was holding its breath. The mountains looked different under the morning light, the snow untouched, except for a trail of prints leading from the barn to the cabin and back. Thomas stood just outside the barn, watching his breath curl into the frozen air, his gloved hands resting against the fence rail. The horses were still there, hadn't bolted in the night, hadn't retreated to the trees once the worst of the storm had blown over. The colt was on his feet this time, a little wobbly, but upright. The mare stood close, eyes calm, ears flicking with each sound. She didn't spook when Thomas approached now. She didn't look ready to flee. She looked present. Every day began the same. Thomas would wake before sunrise, feed Scout, stoke the fire, and take the battered thermos of hot water out to the barn. He brought oats when he had them, hay when he didn't. The horses greeted him with cautious steps at first, but something was changing. The colt would lift his head when Thomas opened the door. The mare had started to lean into his hand just barely when he rubbed the side of her neck. It was slow, unspoken progress, like thawing ice, and yet it felt real. He checked the colt's leg daily, unwrapping the bandages carefully, speaking in a low voice as he worked. The swelling was going down, though the joint was still tender. The colt bore weight now, hesitantly, but stronger with each passing day. Thomas had started calling him Jasper, not out loud at first, just in his mind. The name had come from nowhere, but it fit. Tough, small, resilient. He hadn't named the mare yet. She was something else entirely. Fierce, watchful, almost regal in the way she carried herself. There was no fear in her anymore, just vigilance. He respected that. You don't live through a mountain blizzard and stay soft. Scout kept a respectful distance, but the horses had grown used to him too. Sometimes, when Thomas sat with his back to the barn wall, sipping lukewarm coffee and resting his knees, Scout would lie beside him, and the mare would simply watch. The world outside remained frozen, but inside the barn something warm had taken root. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. One morning, after nearly a week of this routine, Thomas noticed something unusual in the snow. Not tracks from hooves, not Scout's paw prints. These were boots, human footprints, leading up toward the barn and then veering off around the back fence. His pulse jumped instantly. No one ever came out this far. No one even knew how to find this cabin unless they meant to. His mind raced through possibilities. Poachers, lost hikers, someone desperate enough to take what they needed. He grabbed the old rifle that leaned by the door, not because he wanted to use it, but because he'd learned long ago that preparation often made all the difference. Scout was already at his side, ears high, tail rigid. The prints were fresh, no more than an hour old, maybe less. Thomas followed them slowly, step by step, through the powdery snow toward the woods. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy with ice. The wind was still, but the tension in the air buzzed. Then, just past the first rise in the hill, he saw movement. A figure, small, bundled in layers of mismatched winter gear, kneeling near a pine tree. A woman, alone. He approached cautiously, rifle lowered but ready. She heard the crunch of snow and stood, pulling down her scarf. Her face was flushed red from the cold, cheeks chapped, but her eyes were alert. She looked tired, but determined. She introduced herself as Mara Vale, a field biologist with a wildlife tracking organization. She'd been sent to locate a herd of Mustangs displaced by the recent blizzard. They had GPS collars on some of the adults, but the signal from two of them had gone dark right before the storm hit. She'd been combing the area for days, hoping for a sign. Thomas said nothing at first, just stared. Mara went on, explaining how the horses were part of a protected group, studied for their unique migratory patterns through the mountains. Losing even two of them could destabilize the entire herd, especially if one was a juvenile. Her voice cracked slightly when she said that. They were more than data points to her. She cared. And that's when Thomas exhaled, the last of his suspicion bleeding out with the fog of his breath. He led her back to the barn. When Mara saw the horses, her expression crumbled. She didn't cry, not quite, but the emotion hit her hard. She called the mare Sable without hesitation, and explained that the colt, now Jasper, was her last foal, born late in the season. That was why he was smaller, weaker. They must have gotten separated from the main herd when the storm moved in, and instead of following the others, Sable had stayed with her injured son. Mara crouched beside Jasper, speaking softly, reaching out with practiced hands. He didn't shy away. He knew her. She was familiar, safe. Mara looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "You kept them alive," she said. He shrugged. It didn't feel like a heroic thing. It felt like something he'd been called to do. She explained that her team was stationed at the bottom of the canyon, but the snow had blocked the roads. Even if she could radio them, they wouldn't be able to get trucks up for several days. The horses couldn't wait that long. Jasper still needed medical attention, and Sable was running out of reserves. They needed transport. Now. Thomas looked out at the ridge beyond the trees. The snow was deep, the path dangerous, but he had an idea. Old Charlie, a snowbike he hadn't used in years, rusted and grumpy, stored beneath a tarp beside the woodshed. It wasn't built for rescue work, but maybe, just maybe, it could be made ready. And if it worked, they might just stand a chance. Mara didn't hesitate. "Let's try." And in that moment, Thomas realized he was no longer just sheltering two lost animals. He was becoming part of something again, something that mattered. Thomas hadn't touched the snowbike in over 5 years. It sat under a tattered green tarp near the tool shed, half frozen into the earth, looking more like a forgotten relic than a functioning machine. The last time he'd fired it up, he was still trying to convince himself that mountain life would be temporary, that he'd eventually head back down, maybe get a job teaching first aid or wilderness survival. That had all faded like smoke. Now, kneeling beside the rusted chassis, cold metal under his fingertips, it felt like waking up a piece of himself that had been dormant for too long. He pulled the tarp off and inspected the damage. The tires were still inflated, surprisingly. The fuel tank was half full. Battery was dead, of course, but he had a jump starter rigged to a solar panel inside the cabin. The engine was dirty but intact. No cracks in the fuel line, no signs of anything chewed through by rodents. It might just run. Might. Thomas grinned for the first time in days, a real grin, crooked and surprised. There was still a spark left in this old machine, and in him too, apparently. Back in the barn, Mara had begun preparing the horses for transport. She moved with quiet confidence, used to the rhythm of emergency care in the wild. She wrapped Sable's legs in thick gauze to prevent frostbite during the trip and reinforced Jasper's injured limb with a brace she'd crafted from materials in her pack. She didn't waste time asking if Thomas knew what he was doing. She just believed it. That trust stirred something deep in his chest. Something he hadn't felt since the military, being part of a team, each of them relying on the other, wordlessly, without hesitation. They found an old wooden sled behind the cabin, left by the previous owner, probably used for hauling firewood decades ago. Thomas reinforced the sides with planks from a broken chair, then lined the bottom with blankets, hay, and anything soft they could spare. Scout watched with his head tilted, tail wagging in short flicks, sensing the urgency. As dusk settled over the mountains, the sled was nearly ready, and so was Charlie. The engine sputtered to life with a roar that echoed off the trees. It startled the birds from their perches and sent a rabbit darting across the yard, but to Thomas it sounded like victory. He looked at Mara, who just nodded. No high fives, no cheers, just shared determination and silent gratitude. This wasn't about celebration, it was about survival. They let the horses sniff the sled, touch it with their noses, walk circles around it. Sable was wary but didn't panic. Jasper stood a little taller beside her, encouraged by her calm. He still limped, but less with each step. When Thomas gently guided them toward the loading ramp, Sable didn't resist. She seemed to understand. She had fought too long through snow and pain to give up now. They set out before dawn. The sky was ink black, lit only by a faint glow in the east and a trail of stars above. The cold was brutal, sharp enough to cut through layers. Thomas drove. Mara walked alongside the sled, checking the horses constantly, whispering reassurances. Scout trotted ahead, forging a path through the fresh powder. The sled creaked and groaned under the weight, but it held. The journey was harder than they'd imagined. Deep drifts blocked narrow passes, forcing them to reroute twice. Frozen branches hung low over the trail, heavy with icicles, threatening to fall at the slightest shake. At one point, Jasper tripped, falling hard onto the sled's edge. Mara was there instantly, steadying him, adjusting the brace, her hands moving with practiced speed. He stayed calm, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he trusted her. Thomas watched the exchange with quiet awe. He remembered treating soldiers like that, men too broken to speak, yet hanging on by a thread of belief that someone was fighting for them. Hours passed. The trees grew denser, the wind stronger. Snow began falling again, soft at first, then thick and fast. Visibility dropped and the trail became nearly impossible to follow. Charlie growled under the strain, the engine beginning to cough. Thomas pushed forward, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the path and the horses. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, not just for Sable and Jasper, but for Mara too, for all the people out there who had stopped believing anyone would show up for them. By mid-afternoon they reached the edge of a ravine. A frozen creek snaked along the bottom, the ice gleaming beneath the gathering snow. Thomas paused, heart pounding. The path ahead was narrow, winding between boulders and sheer drops. One wrong turn, and the sled could flip. Mara stepped up beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "We'll make it," she said simply, not because she was sure, but because she needed him to be. As they pushed forward, the wind howled through the canyon walls like a voice from the past. Scout barked suddenly, then darted up the trail toward a dark opening in the rock, a shallow cave just big enough for shelter. Thomas veered toward it without a word. Inside it was cold but shielded. No wind, just rock, earth, and enough space for them all to huddle together. They led the horses in slowly, laying fresh hay and covering them with the blankets that hadn't already frozen stiff. They lit a small fire from the emergency kindling in Mara's pack. The flame was tiny, barely enough to warm their hands, but the light it cast made the cave feel less like a trap and more like a haven. Sable lay down beside Jasper, curling her body around his as if to say, "I've got you." Scout nestled between Thomas and the fire, head resting on his boot. Mara sat on the opposite side, staring into the flames. Her face was worn but calm. "You're good with them," she said softly. Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the horses breathe in unison, watched the fire flicker against the stone. "They just needed someone who wouldn't give up on them," he finally said. Then, after a beat, "So did I." In that moment there were no walls between them, no pasts, no mistakes, no pain too heavy to carry, just a man, a woman, two animals and a dog, together in a cave, fighting back the dark. And for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel like a ghost hiding from the world. He felt alive, pulled forward by something bigger than himself, something that still had a reason to keep going. By morning the storm had passed again, leaving behind a brittle hush and a white world untouched by anything but their own breath. The mouth of the cave opened to a pale sky, the sun a dim circle behind gauze-thin clouds. Thomas stepped out first, boots crunching through the new snow, scanning the trail ahead. The winds had flattened the drifts and exposed the creek path, narrow but navigable. His breath puffed clouds into the air, and for a long moment he just stood there, staring down the valley where the world waited. Somewhere beyond those hills, Mara's team was still hoping, still waiting for word. The snowmobile was stiff in the cold, and the sled had shifted slightly in the night, but everything was intact. It could work, if they were careful. Back inside the cave, Mara was already awake, kneeling beside Jasper and checking the brace. His eyes were clearer now, brighter. There was life behind them again. Sable stood nearby, alert as ever, though her ears flicked gently toward Mara's voice. The bond between them had grown in ways words couldn't explain. These weren't just wild creatures anymore. They were part of something now, part of them. Thomas helped Mara pack the remaining supplies, carefully layering what little food and water they had left. He tightened the sled harness around Charlie and patted the engine casing like an old friend. "Just one more stretch," he muttered under his breath. The descent through the canyon was the most dangerous part. Ice clung to the rocks, and the trail wound tightly along ledges where one wrong shift could mean disaster. Thomas drove with white knuckles, every muscle in his body tense. Mara walked beside the sled again, one hand on Jasper's flank, keeping him steady, her other hand always near the edge in case she needed to push, brace, stop something from tipping. Time slowed. At one point, a sudden gust sent a curtain of snow spilling off the ridge, blinding them. The sled tilted hard to one side. Jasper squealed, legs scrambling for purchase. Sable reared, hooves crashing into the snow, eyes wide in panic. But Thomas didn't flinch. He turned in his seat, reached out and said her name, Sable, just once, calm, steady, like someone who'd been through worse and had survived. The mare stopped shaking. She lowered her head, touched Jasper's side with her nose, and they moved forward again, inch by inch, step by step, until finally they rounded the last turn in the trail and the trees opened to a clearing. There, at the base of the hill, stood a transport truck, its doors open, tailgate lowered, and two volunteers waving. One of them shouted, and Mara broke into a run. She didn't cry, but her shoulders shook with relief. They'd made it. The volunteers moved quickly and gently, guiding the horses onto the transport with quiet voices and patient hands. Jasper limped a little but didn't resist. He stepped onto the ramp like he understood it was the final leg of the journey. Sable followed close, head held high, eyes never leaving Thomas until the very end. Just before the ramp closed, he stepped up and pressed his hand to her muzzle. Her breath was warm against his skin. No words were spoken, none were needed. The truck rumbled to life and began rolling out of the clearing, disappearing slowly into the snow-laced forest. Thomas stood watching long after it was gone, boots rooted in the frost, heart heavier and lighter all at once. Mara came to stand beside him. Her gloved hand brushed against his, and for a moment they simply stood there, silent witnesses to something they couldn't fully explain. Back at the cabin, the barn felt strangely empty. The straw was flattened, the blanket still carried the scent of warm bodies, and hoofprints marked the frozen ground. Scout sniffed the ground once, then lay down in the middle of it, ears back. Thomas didn't say anything. He just stood in the doorway and looked around. The quiet wasn't oppressive anymore. It was full of echoes, footsteps, snorts, the rustle of hay, the flicker of firelight in a cold cave. He returned to his cabin, brewed a pot of coffee, and stared out the window toward the ridge where the trail vanished. For once the silence didn't press in on him. It held him gently, like a pause rather than a void. 2 weeks passed, snow melted, then froze again. Scout chased birds through the trees and dozed by the fire. Life fell back into rhythm, but something had shifted. Thomas found himself checking the road each morning, listening for sounds, hoping for something. It came in the form of an envelope, hand-delivered by one of Mara's team on a supply run. Inside were photos, Sable and Jasper standing tall, healthy, coats shining under winter sun. Jasper's leg had healed. Sable had rejoined the herd. The last photo was of them galloping across an open plain, muscles taut, heads high, wild and free. There was also a letter, handwritten. Mara's script was strong and sure. She thanked him, told him the release would be in early spring, and that she wanted him there, that they wanted him there. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and zipped it shut like a promise. Spring came slow in the mountains, but it came. The snow retreated from the trees first, then the trails, then the cliffs. The world seemed to breathe again. On the day of the release, Thomas stood on a ridge with Scout by his side and Mara a few steps away. Below them, the herd clustered at the edge of a wide open field, 20, maybe 30 horses. Sable stood near the front, Jasper at her flank, taller now, stronger. The gates opened, and just like that they ran, not away, not in fear, but forward into something boundless. Jasper's hooves kicked up sprays of dust as he galloped. Sable moved like wind through tall grass, each step a declaration of survival. They disappeared into the golden hills, into the wild, into home. Thomas didn't move, he didn't speak, but his chest rose in a way it hadn't in years, full, deep, alive. Sometimes, he thought, healing doesn't come in clinics or crowded rooms. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in frost-covered hooves, in the way two broken things can lean on each other and stand tall again. Sometimes when you save someone else, you finally remember how to save yourself.